The death of Sega as a console manufacturer. There's no bigger story among retro gamers than what caused Sega to leave the console market and become a third-party company. This video will point out some key players as well as the other companies Nintendo, Sony as well as Microsoft getting into the market. Tom Kalinske. Tom Kalinske was hired in 1990 by Sega of Japan, impressed by the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive, and only having sold a couple of million units he knew it needed better marketing. 1990 to 1994 were the best years financially for Sega of America. The Genesis were aggressively marketed and was narrowly beating SNES. Due to decisions such as making Sonic the Hedgehog the pack-in game replacing Altered Beast. At the same time attracting kids to the Genesis, but heavily marketed to young adults. In 1993 Sega had over 60% of the market. Nintendo previously had no competition due to strict policies. They had been a juggernaut in gaming with the NES. Sega had a 2-year head start as well. They were marketed to be different than Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was released 1991 and become a successful system, eventually beating Sega in sales. 1994. At the Winter CES show, R&D head for Sega of America Joe Miller had a phone call in his room with Hayata Nakayama from Sega of Japan. He was concerned about the fact Atari, who had not been relevant and since 1983 and many in the industry saw as the company that nearly killed gaming. It was cause Atari released their new Jaguar system, supposedly 64-bit. This ended up with Sega starting work on the 32X. The Sega Genesis/Mega Drive already had a ad on the Sega CD. However, it wasn't a big seller and had more of niche audience. It wasn't a selling point for why people wanted a Genesis. Scott Bayless, who was a producer at Sega, said the 32X made us look greedy and dumb. The goal was to make the 32X a cheaper alternative to newer systems, coming with a price point of $159. Tom Kalinske had a party and brought in gaming journalists from across the country to San Francisco. The party was to show off 32X games. It had music, including a local rapper. The music was so loud the games were seen as lackluster. The journalists wanted to leave. The buses had left, meaning they had to stay until the end of the party. The 32X was released on November 21st. 1994. At that same time, Sega in Japan released their 32-bit system, the Sega Saturn, and was an instant smash hit in Japan. The 32X though did sell about 500,000 units by Christmas. 1995. 1995 Nintendo had caught up and had a great library of games such as A Link to the Past, Super Mario World, and the compilation of the old NES Mario games Super Mario All-Stars, along with Metroid, etc. Also, they could do games with advanced graphics without the need of an add-on with the Super FX chip. In September, Sega was set to release the Saturn in the United States and Europe. Sony was going to enter the market with the first PlayStation in September as well. Sony got into the market after working on a sound chip for the Super Nintendo, and Sony also began work on a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. In fact, a prototype of an all-in-one SNES PlayStation was found in 2015. This deal fell through due cause Sony was going to make money off all the SNES CD hardware and software. Add to the fact Sega's CD add-on wasn't a top-selling item and wasn't the reason why the Genesis was popular. Popularity of console come for offering good games and not amazing graphics.
Any ground, it says technology's only one thing.
First and foremost, it's games. Always games. It's like opening up a new movie theater that's got 16 stereophonic sound. If you don't have any fun movies to watch, who's gonna go?
Until
after Sony and Nintendo deal fell through, Tom Kalinske wanted to work with Sony and later on Silicon Graphics to possibly release an exclusive console for the United States and Europe only. Sega of Japan denied him on both accounts. Sony went on to release the first PlayStation. Silicon Graphics went on to work with Nintendo to release the Nintendo 64. Sega of Japan wanted Tom Kalinske to have surprise launch of the Sega Saturn, releasing it in May instead of September. During the Sega presentation at E3 1995, which was the very first E3, Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn was already out. The Saturn was launched at $400. However, there were few Saturn games ready at this point. The launch games weren't the most impressive, and Virtua Fighter, a massive hit in Japan, wasn't a heavy hitter in the United States. In fact, the port of Virtua Fighter in the States was somewhat incomplete, which caused Sega to release a revision to fix bugs. The only real game out that would make people interested was Shinobi Legions. At Sony's presentation at E3 95, they announced that the PlayStation would release at $300 instead of $400. Retailers such as KB Toys dropped Sega entirely from their stores, as many felt they had so much hardware on the market that it was just taking up space outside of the Genesis, which games were still being released for, such as Vector Man and Comic Zone. In fact, Genesis games were still being released into 1997. Nintendo continued on with no new system, but began a business relationship with Rare, a British company who released Donkey Kong Country on the SNES in November 1994. They'd port their arcade game Killer Instinct on SNES in 1995. However, Nintendo wasn't ready to release their new system, known as the Ultra 64, at that time. In September of 1995, the PlayStation was released. It outsold the Saturn despite a 4+ month head start. Games available were Ridge Racer and Tekken in Europe, where Sega was dominant, had lost to the PlayStation. Many people saw that 3D was better on the PlayStation than the Sega Saturn. That is due to the Saturn being made a 2D system from the start, with 3D included later during development. At this time, the Saturn and the Genesis wasn't the only thing that was out on the market. The Sega Master System, released in 1985 in Japan and in 1986 in the rest of the world, was still being supported in some regions. The handheld system, the Game Gear, was still on the market as well. The Sega CD and Sega 32X were also. Sega had recently released the Nomad, a handheld Sega Genesis that failed to appeal to the masses cause of a very low battery life. At this point in late 1995, they had 7 different consoles on the market, meaning they were losing a lot of money. The 32X was forgotten about as soon as early 95. It had went down from $159.99 to $20. In October of 95, Sega marked down the Sega Saturn to $300 and released high-quality home ports of Virtua Fighter 2 and Virtua Cop, an arcade light gun shooter. Sales did increase during the holidays. However, PlayStation was already #1 since its September release, 1996. Sega knew they needed to turn a profit or break even with the Saturn. The Saturn lacking a Sonic game, which was the mascot of the company. Work began for Sonic Extreme. It was going to be the first 3D Sonic game. As Nintendo was ready to launch the Nintendo 64 and Mario 64, the first 3D Mario game was going to launch with the Nintendo 64. Sega needed a Sonic game at least to create demand for the Saturn, as Sonic was one of the reasons why the Genesis/Mega Drive ended up selling over 33 million units worldwide in its lifespan. Another game that was going to release in 1996 was Yuji Naka's Nights into Dreams, that used 2D and 3D both. The team working on Sonic Extreme wanted to use the engine used for Nights into Dreams, as they needed the tools to make this game. Yuji Naka threatened to quit Sega if they used the Nights into Dreams engine. Yuji Naka has denied this. However, knowing how Sega of Japan was micromanaging Tom Kalinske in Sega of America, we should take what was said with a grain of salt. Programmers and coders worked around the clock after weeks of work went down the drain. The October release for Sonic Extreme was pushed back for Christmas. Programmers and coders worked around the clock with little sleep and were practically living in Sega's headquarters to get the game done on time, causing a developer, Chris Coffin, to become ill. Sonic Extreme didn't come out and was cancelled in January of 1997. A port of the game Sonic 3D Blast was released on the Saturn instead. It was basically an enhanced port of the Genesis game as a consolation. Tom Kalinske left Sega as CEO in the summer of 1996 after basically seeing the writing on the wall and being micromanaged by Sega of Japan. Resident Evil on the PlayStation was released in March of 1996. Sega discontinued the 32X after being on the market only 14 to 15 months in early 1996. The Sega CD was also discontinued and the Sega Genesis was on its way out, although Vector Man 2 and Sonic 3D Blast were released. In September of '96 the Nintendo 64 was released after a lot of anticipation and wait, launching at $200 with games like Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64. Sony and Sega dropped the prices of their systems going into the holidays. Many third parties went with Sony due to them being easier to work with and their console being the easiest to program for. CDs were cheaper than cartridges, which the Nintendo 64 used. However, some third parties like Midway did release games for the 64. Capcom and Konami did release a handful of titles later on. Third-party companies did release games on the Saturn, but most of the time they were seen as inferior to the PlayStation versions. Mainly 3D, as a lot of 2D fighting games looked arcade perfect or near arcade perfect. Bernie Stolar became the CEO of Sega of America. Many people on the internet see him as the man that killed Sega, however it's untrue, but he made bad calls which hurt Sega. Stolar was a former Sony Computer Entertainment of America executive that oversaw the release of the Sony PlayStation. He wanted to turn Sega around. Sega was entering 1997 with no Sonic game, other heavy hitters such as Streets of Rage, which Streets of Rage 4 was in development hell at this point, along with no Golden Axe game. The only Golden Axe released was Golden Axe the Duel, a long forgotten arcade fighting game. Die-hard Sega fans wanted Golden Axe the Revenge of Death Adder, which came out in the arcades in 1992. Sonic 3D Blast on the Saturn was nothing more than an enhanced version of the Genesis game. Sega was starting to look irrelevant. 1997. 1997 is the only year in recent memory that a gaming company looked irrelevant. While in Japan the Sega Saturn enjoyed success that their previous consoles did not. In the States the Genesis was a popular system, but the Saturn failed to capture the audience the way that the PlayStation was, and the recently released Nintendo 64. Sega was now a very distant third place. Sony was printing money. Nintendo had crossover appeal not just with families but adults and females. Games like Turok Dinosaur Hunter and Star Wars Rouge Squadron were released in early '97. Then in April Doom 64 got released on the Nintendo 64, a new chapter in the Doom franchise, and was not merely a port. The Sega Saturn got a Doom game too, which could have been one of the best ports. It turned out to be the worst port, coming over a year and a half after the PlayStation port of Doom. Mainly due to internal problems at ID Software. It ran at an amazing 5 frames per second. Anticipation was being built for the release of Resident Evil 2, due out in May, but was scrapped and started over, meaning it was coming the next year. At Sega, new CEO Bernie Stolar made bad calls, starting with no Japanese role-playing games, also known as JRPGs, no 2D games, a 5-star game policy. Meanwhile, Japan saw a lot of solid 2D games for the Saturn along with RPGs. Fighting games on the Saturn were considered the better versions to have. X-Men vs Street Fighter, released by Capcom. The Saturn port was arcade perfect and had the tag team gameplay. When released on the PlayStation, the tag team gameplay was removed and was scaled back due to memory. The Saturn in Japan started incorporating a 4MB RAM card that cut down and loading times and made a lot of the fighting games look exactly like the arcade. While in the United States and Europe we got peanuts. Neo Geo released quite a few titles for the Saturn that only made it in Japan. That also at E3 1997, Working Designs, a company that did translations for JRPGs, had their booth moved away from Sega's. They were the biggest supporter of Sega, which started a big dispute between the two companies. Then the biggest blunder of all time happened at this E3. Bernie Stolar announced during the Sega presentation that the Saturn is not our future, effectively killing the Sega Saturn then and there with only 2 years on the market. If anything was the final straw, this would be it. A consumer who, let's say, believed in Sega invested in the 32X cause they believed it was going to be this cheap alternative, but then to have it discontinued and they decide to purchase a Saturn was now being told that this system they bought a year to a year and a half ago is now no damn good. This caused the consumer to be burned. Sega's credibility was further damaged. The United States saw Castlevania Symphony of the Night released in the fall on the PlayStation. Also, Square Enix released Final Fantasy VII a JRPG, which helped move more PlayStation units. In the meantime, a port of Resident Evil was released on the Saturn. This port was built from the ground up due to memory issues with the Saturn, and the backgrounds looked amazing since the original Resident Evil games used 2D pre-rendered backgrounds on the 3D plane. Character models on the Saturn Resident Evil did look noticeably worse. Die Hard Arcade also got a home release on Saturn. Duke Nukem, a popular PC first-person shooter or FPS, was released on the Saturn and is considered the best home console port of that era. Duke Nukem on Saturn included online gameplay, but it was nothing that could give Sega a shot in the arm. It was too late for the Saturn at this point. Nintendo in August hit big with GoldenEye 007, a game based on the movie that came out 2 years prior. But you could have called the game Never Say Never Again and it still would have done well. Cause it was fun, but there was a lot of fun to be had with the multiplayer. Nintendo was clearly becoming the home of FPS games, while Sony was establishing itself with story-driven adventure games while taking away the RPG audience from Sega and Nintendo. While Sega looked like a lesser version of Sony. Sony took a lot of marketing strategies from Sega during their peak Genesis years and was doing it better than they could. While Nintendo was trying to do everything different than what Sony was doing. 1998. 98 began with a bang as Resident Evil 2 was released on the PlayStation after being delayed for nearly a year. Sold very well later that year, a DualShock version was released making use of the analog stick. Nintendo got a lot of hype for The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time being anticipated since November 1995 had undergone different builds. Acclaim announced Turok 2 Seeds of Evil, a sequel to Turok Dinosaur Hunter. Sega in the meantime liquidated their Saturn stock as systems were being sold for $100, $50 in some cases. Games were being sold from anywhere from $5 to $10. All the good titles flew off the shelf. The remaining North American games for the Saturn were Burning Rangers, Daytona Online, Panzer Dragoon Saga, a port of the Sega arcade light gun shooter House of the Dead, and finally at the end of the year Working Designs released Magic Knight Rayart. These games got no attention and flew under the radar, with many needing to be special ordered at your electronics boutique. Babbage and Funkoland, for example. Japan got a port of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which ended up being a flawed port and not taking advantage of the powerhouse 2D capabilities of the Saturn. Deep Fear was released in the summer of 1998. It turned out to be the final European Saturn game, as the Saturn did poorly over in Europe after being the most popular gaming company in Europe. Deep Fear never saw a US or North American release. Despite announced Resident Evil 2 for the Sega Saturn was cancelled. Nintendo also built up another audience that drove Nintendo 64 sales, a wrestling fan base, which the WWF's Raw's War and WCW's Nitro were the two biggest shows on TV at that time. A Japanese company, Aki, allowed THQ to translate games, and originally THQ released WCW games WCW World Tour in 1997 and in fall of '98 WCW NWO Revenge, which later on the WWF struck a deal with them and they made WWF games. As well, Banjo-Kazooie came out in June, developed by Rare. Nintendo attempting to pull in more families and kids. Dreamcast was announced by Sega and was released in Japan in late 1998. The Japanese release did not meet sales goals and reportedly people returned consoles in favor of PlayStation software and or Sega Saturn software. Saturn games were still being released in Japan. Sony further dropped the price of the PlayStation for the holidays. Nintendo hit really big in November with Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Pre-orders also included a special edition gold cartridge. Turok 2 was released in December. continuing to establish themselves as the home of first-person shooters. The final Saturn game was released in December Magic Knight Rayearth but went under the radar. The game now commands a high price on places like eBay and Amazon. PlayStation was becoming the home of survival horror games RPGs. In 1 week Ocarina of Time sold 1 million copies. By the year 2000 it was announced that Ocarina of Time sold 7 million units. In Japan it sold another 1.14 million. The game made $400 million in revenue for Nintendo. The rivalry was very clearly Nintendo vs Sony and would stay that was for the foreseeable future. 1999. Sega had nothing going on except hype for the upcoming Dreamcast launch. Sony and Nintendo on the other hand came off a great Christmas. The start of the year saw Konami release Silent Hill, a survival horror game that saw continued success of the genre on the PlayStation. Another survival horror game came out in the summer, Dino Crisis. At the end of the year Resident Evil 3 was released on PlayStation. Nintendo did get a Resident Evil game, Resident Evil 2, which was an impressive port where not many corners were cut. On September 9, 1999 the Sega Dreamcast was released, a very successful launch with lots of marketing going during the summer. Vice President Peter Moore said this was an apology to consumers. Its launch made $98 million in revenue. By November the Dreamcast sold 3 million units. Bernie Stolar had patched things up with retailers. EA no longer wanted to make any games for Sega, which started the 2K line of sports games. Games at release were Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi and Namco Arcade Fighter Soul Calibur. However, right before the Dreamcast's release Bernie Stolar was fired. In March 1999 Sony of Japan announced that a new system on its way out, the PlayStation 2. It was coming out in 2000. It was going to make use of DVDs, meaning you very well had not only a new console but a DVD player as well. PlayStation 1 games would be backwards compatible. The market looked great as Sega's Dreamcast. They now had 15% of the market, meaning they might be able to compete with Sony and Nintendo. 2000. After a successful launch and holiday season, things were looking up for Sega. 2000 saw rumors of Nintendo releasing a new console in 2001. As well, rumors were coming out about Microsoft getting into the market too. Microsoft had helped develop the Dreamcast. March saw financial reports come out about fiscal year 1999, which saw Sega lose over $404 million in revenue. Sales of the Dreamcast cooled off by January. March saw Resident Evil Code Veronica, a new exclusive title for the Dreamcast, released. It was also the first fully 3D Resident Evil title. The end of the year saw ports of Resident Evil 2 and 3 on Dreamcast, which are seen as the most superior versions. They were sold as budget titles, sold at $20 a piece. With word of Microsoft getting into the console market, CEO Peter Moore knew the market would be crowded with 4 companies not seen since the early 80s. Which contributed to the downfall of the gaming market in 1983. Moore knew they needed to turn a profit. Another issue was copy protection. From the launch to about October of 2000, all Dreamcast consoles manufactured at this time had no copy protection, which meant anyone could take a Dreamcast game that was basically copied, a bootleg so to speak, and put it in their Dreamcast and it would play with no problem. The final Nintendo 64 Turok game came out, Turok 3, in August. May saw Rare release a FPS Perfect Dark, which they called their spiritual successor to GoldenEye, released 3 years earlier. As well, late in the year Activision released a James Bond game, The World Is Not Enough, based on the film of the same name that came out a year before. Anticipation for the PlayStation 2 was building as March saw it released in Japan, selling 1.5 million units in a month. Notable titles came out for the PlayStation as well, such as Dino Crisis 2 in the summer as Strider 2, a port of the arcade game. Not only that, but the original 1989 Strider was packed in 2, which was an arcade perfect port. A Dreamcast port of Strider 2 was announced, however was cancelled. October saw the release of Alien Resurrection, based off the movie which came out 3 years prior. The game has since garnered a cult following. The Dreamcast started doing online gaming with SegaNet. Peter Moore announced they'd need to sell 5 million Dreamcasts by the end of 2000. The Dreamcast price was marked down to $149.99, and that caused them more of a financial loss, cause you're actual losing money when you sell for less than its market price and with not a huge demand. Financial reports came out in September showing Sega lost $161.11 million so far in 2000. In October, Sony released the PlayStation 2, where demand was so high that stores didn't have enough in stock for the holidays. Sega hoped this would help sell additional consoles. With a $150 price point cheaper than a $300 PlayStation 2, along with Sega offering a free Dreamcast keyboard along with a 18-month subscription to SegaNet. It wasn't enough. People would have rather waited till early the next year for their PS2. Sega only sold 3 million, 2 million short of the 5 million goal. In the meantime, Sony would continue to sell PlayStation 1 games as well. They released a smaller, cheaper second model. Nintendo released Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, a sequel to the wildly popular Ocarina of Time, in October. September saw Peter Moore suggest that Sega should get out of the console market altogether. Some of Sega's executives in Japan had been echoing the same thing. This caused studio heads to walk out. November saw Sega release Shenmue. It already came out in Japan the year before, now was being released in the States. This was going to be the game to have that deep movie-like feel that Sega was trying to attract. Yu Suzuki, who previously made arcade games in the 80s and 90s, wanted a longer movie-type game that was story-driven. The budget was astronomical, with a budget anywhere from $40 to $70 million. In all fairness, part of the budget was to cover Shenmue 2. Ideas for the game began in 1996. At the time, this was the most expensive video game released. Selling 1.2 million copies, it didn't recoup the budget. After 6 years of bad decisions, such as an add-on for a pre-existing console when a new console was on its way out, then discontinuing the add-on after 14 to 15 months on the market, then discontinuing the current console after 2 years, it looked if Sega couldn't come back after burning the consumers one too many times. With Sony controlling 50% of the market, 35% controlled by Nintendo, 15% going to Sega. 2001. On January 31, 2001, Sega announced that they were no longer in the console market. The Dreamcast was discontinued 2 months later after only 18 months. If anyone had anything to do with the end of Sega as console manufacturer, it was Sega of Japan and Peter Moore, as he ended up working at Microsoft for their Xbox division. Japan saw Resident Evil Code Veronica X released, known as Biohazard Code Veronica Kenzanbane. Over there, this was an extended cut that saw newer cutscenes added. However, it wasn't released for the Dreamcast in the States. Recode Veronica X was released on PlayStation 2 in August. Nintendo 64 saw Conker's Bad Fur Day released. Originally made as a kids game, as development went on, Rare made more and more adult, which got an M rating. Peter Moore of Sega worked a deal with Microsoft for Shenmue 2. While released in Japan in September and Europe in November respectively, Shenmue 2 wouldn't see an American release until October 2002 for the Xbox. In March of 2001, Microsoft had a big presentation that included Bill Gates and the biggest star in professional wrestling, The Rock, attending. After a week launch lineup the previous year, the PlayStation 2 saw Silent Hill 2 released in September. At the end of the year, Metal Gear Solid 2. Nintendo GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox were going to be released in November, signaling an end to the 5th generation console war, with Sega losing twice compared to the numbers that the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64 sold. Even if you combined the total of sales that the Saturn and Dreamcast had, they wouldn't even match the number of units the Nintendo 64 sold in the States. At the same time, sales of the Nintendo 64 fell very short of what the PlayStation did. Nintendo also had become the underdog going into the sixth console generation. Microsoft at this time, clearly number one when it came to PCs, was an unknown when it came to gaming. So Nintendo and Microsoft was either going to be different or be a lesser version of Sony.